Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How Patient Phenotyping Can Help Power Value-Based Care. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation plus a panel, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. We will also have a series of poll questions during today's webinar. You can submit the answer that best applies to you directly on your screen. Thank you so much in advance for your participation. And if at any time you don't see your slides moving or have trouble with the audio, try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We are here to help. With that, I am pleased to turn the floor over to today's speakers, who will introduce themselves before our presentation. With us today are Brian Lee, the Vice President of Solutions at Apixio, and Terry Ward, the Senior Vice President of Solutions at Apixio. Terry and Brian, thank you for being here today. Brian, can you kick off the conversation?
And thank you very much, Morgan. On behalf of Terry Ward and myself, we would like to extend a very warm virtual welcome to everyone that's joined us for our discussion today. As many of you are well understand, healthcare organizations are successful when they balance both patient satisfaction, care coordination, and reduce medical costs, while at the same time protecting their bottom line. A key factor in these efforts is to have access to data that can be easily captured and structured in a way that allows for simple analysis and focused, actionable insights. Getting the data needed that has just for the longest time been much easier said than done up until now. Today, Terry and I are going to help you understand what to consider as you're navigating the world of phenotypes and data acquisition. We do look forward to your answering your questions. So if you would take advantage of the Q&A box, as Morgan had indicated, we'd be delighted to be able to answer your questions as we go throughout the presentation. To begin, a little background on Terry and myself. I began my healthcare career in Medicare back in the 80s, about the time when we were trying to figure out what RBRVS meant, and well before the industry understood what HCCs and RAF scores and such were. I've led a number of government program organizations within the IDS world, as well as in a number of the Blues plans. All the time I focused on leveraging technology, continually improve our complete and accurate and timely collection, analysis, and reporting of data. I've been in this space for quite some time and love it. My passion around this really brought me into the tech space about 10 years ago, where I've been able to really help my peers improve their processes through leveraging technology. Terry?
Thanks, Brian. My name is Terry Ward. I'm a peer of Brian's at Apixio as the Senior Vice President of Solutions. My career in healthcare has spanned approximately 30 years across the provider, payer, and vendor space, leading both field-facing roles such as customer success and account management. But over the last 15 years, I have led bringing solutions to market for organizations such as McKesson, Optum, United Healthcare, as well as Change Healthcare before joining the Apixio team just over 2 years ago. That's a little bit about Brian and I. I'd like to do is, as we mentioned, both Brian and I are from Apixio. For those that aren't familiar with Apixio, Apixio is an organization that has been integrating structured and unstructured information, including from medical charts, for over 10 years, with the goal of accurately capturing a patient's clinical profile. For the last 7 of those years, Apixio has been focused on directing this expertise and our market-leading artificial intelligence on risk adjustment. And for the last 2 years, we've expanded from risk adjustment into both interoperability, quality, as well as prior authorization. Apixio's focus has resulted in being named #1 best in class by its customers in risk adjustment and analytics. And with its growth, with Apixio's growth, we have been listed in Deloitte's technology Fast 500, 2 years running. In the artificial intelligence space, experience and volume matters. Apixio has trained its science models, its artificial intelligence science models, on over 21 million charts, really perfecting the models to help bring insights, resulting in deploying solutions that are achieving the type of efficiency and success and return on investment our customers are seeking. As evidenced on the right-hand side, we are really promoting success by driving this efficiency to allow our client organizations to do more with same, to increase the accuracy in a high-trust, secure manner as possible. With that, as a bit of a background about Brian and I, as well as Apixio, I want to state what our objectives and what you really will be walking away from today's discussion learning. Today, we will be looking at the concepts of a patient profile from a much more detailed and extensive perspective to help understand how leveraging the living and breathing longitudinal medical record is used to help form a patient's phenotype. That is, in turn, then leveraged to power insights for your value-based care programs.
Terry, let's jump into a quick poll question. Let's ask the audience if they would be so kind as to help us understand how familiar you are with the concepts around a longitudinal medical record, or if you will, for your health system in particular. So give just a moment and get your insight, and then we'll jump into our presentation.
This will be one of two polls. We'll be a little bit later asking again for your experience in the market. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes.
This will inspire a few individuals to start asking some questions. That looks like we have some coming in. So it's wonderful. So let's and if none of the responses, the unfamiliar, somewhat familiar, or very familiar with this, don't fit your classification, well, feel free to throw your answer in the Q&A. Sometimes you may be uncertain in terms of what a longitudinal record is altogether. So, Terry, we have results we can take a look at, and
I'm not seeing results yet. So if we don't get any, in just a minute here, we'll go ahead and give a little background on some of the terms that folks might be hearing today.
Why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's go ahead and move to our next slide, Terry.
Great.
So to make you familiar with some of the terms that we're going to use within our talk today, we talk about natural language processing, or NLP. It's really a subfield of linguistics, computer science, and artificial intelligence. And it's really concerned about the interaction between the computer and human language, in particular how the program computes or processes and analyzes large amounts of natural language data. Faxes, mail, your objects that are translated into to machine readable information. Really, it's accurately extracting that information and providing kind of insights contained within those documents, helping them to categorize, organize those documents so that they can be used further. I like to give an example. An example of natural language processing, if you will, on a daily basis is when we ask Siri for directions to our nearest coffee shop. Another example might be when you ask Alexis to play your favorite song. So we're going to use natural language processing. It's just implied in a lot of the phenotyping activities that we go on. So it's helpful for us to clarify. Additionally, machine learning, it's also an application of artificial intelligence. So it's just a refinement of it. It involves computers discovering how they can perform tasks without being explicitly programmed to do so. We all hear of rules-based engines. Well, this is allowing the engine to create their rules from themselves. Allows them to build those algorithms based upon the experience they have from the data, looking at patterns within the data. Turns out that they are much more efficient helping themselves build their own algorithms than it is when we have intervention. They always say that to make an error is human. To really compound that is when the machine has to learn from the human. So the example would be letting the machine determine those learnings from the data that they have received. The example I often give when I talk about machine learning is, gee, I sure wish my spell checker on my cell phone would remember when I'm texting out that I really meant to say something other than what they sent out for me. I'd like to be able to take that text back sometimes. The last term I wanted to introduce you to, which many of you are very familiar with given the current deadlines that we're all facing in healthcare, is around interoperability. And it really enables healthcare organizations to leverage different information technology systems to communicate and exchange usable data. Really, the shorthand on that is it's allowing providers, payers, as well as the regulators, access to the data that we're using every day to manage our patients and interact with our members. Interoperability is evolving and maturing every day. The core of it is the ability for the systems and devices to exchange and interpret and store that common set of data under a common set of standards. Example I give here is I suspect many of you have incorporated interoperability into your everyday lives with the Fitbit that you're wearing on your wrist, or the pacemaker that you have had embedded, or possibly even a CGM. So all uses of interoperability that you've experienced today. Terry, why don't you take us through some of the current challenges that we're facing with the healthcare data?
Yeah, and that's great, Brian. I think just a quick pause. We did get some results, just so the audience knows, those around you on the virtual conference. It looks like those in terms of familiarity with the longitudinal medical record, about half, 44% are unfamiliar. Another third, 37% are somewhat familiar, with 20%, or actually 19% being familiar. So that's very helpful to really, as we go into making sure that we are considering your knowledge on the subject. And we'll be asking you a similar question in just a few minutes about one of our topics on phenotype. We also did receive a question, Brian, around how Apixio develops AI models and how it deploys them to engage patients and close gaps. So let's just, if you don't mind, we'll pause on that for a second. Brian, I'll start, and if you want to add anything to really round that out, that'd be fantastic. Apixio has been in the space for, as I mentioned, 10 years developing AI models, and it's really looking across the ecosystem of structured chart claim data, whether it be a scanned image or electronically available. So that unstructured data with structured data, whether it be claims or in the risk arena, a RAPS file, as well as other demographic information, electronically available data. And it's really looking, and it's learned over that 21 million charts, or the 21 million members worth of information that's been processed, to understand patterns that are either causal in nature, you see X and it results in Y, or correlated in nature. And it really results in the risk arena, two types of insights. One type of insight, and this is where the RAPS file comes into play, which is part of your question, is really, is this a risk or a type of condition that has been coded in the past, been present in the past, that we expect that to continue, like diabetes or other chronic conditions that are not temporary in nature, versus those that are true suspects, meaning that all of our AI experience with high precision indicates that while it's not been coded, this condition is well worth either bringing forward to a coder or a physician to consider. And so we do use our AI in a couple areas. One is to identify risk insights. Do we fully capture that clinical profile, that risk profile for a patient? On the flip side, we also look to say, hey, has there been a risk condition that's been coded that we don't see being affirmed by documentation? As well as, for the last 2 years, we've been working in the quality arena, where we actually will look at members in which the client has indicated that there's a gap in quality. Maybe it's a diabetic that needs that annual glucose exam, that annual evaluation and management. And we actually run our science to look through all and comb through all that data to identify, hey, you really don't need to reorder that service. We actually find that represented, the latest blood pressure taken, that we actually see it represented so that it can be abstracted and that there's not abrasion by having that provider order another test. So we do use those sources, and we are pointing at both retrospective and prospective risk as well as quality. Brian, did I miss anything in addressing their question?
I think one thing I'd like to highlight is just around I call it CAT. It's something you'll hear me talk about a lot on presentations, and that is that we strive for complete capture of accurate and timely data. And that's really, I think, important. It's kind of at the core of a couple of the questions. I think Lyle was asking about how we're leveraging, risk adjustment data within the data science. Well, that is just one component to create that complete and accurate profile of the member. And I think that it was also asking in terms of, how we go about getting that patient engagement. Well, we try to meet those the providers at the point of care where they're delivering it to ensure that they have that complete and accurate, that complete profile of the member. As we talk further around patient and member phenotyping, you're going to find that it's very imperative that timing is relevant, that you want to make sure you have the evidence that is timely in front of the provider at the time in which they meet with that member.
Yeah, I think you highlighted two things I just want to emphasize. One is the value that our customers are receiving is really broken up into two main value statements. One, Lyle, you're asking about our artificial intelligence so that we can point those clinicians, those coders, right to the pages in that chart. It's a 100-page chart. Let's draw them right into the 2 pages that artificial intelligence is indicating that needs their attention. The other is workflow, as Brian mentioned, is that a lot of efficiency is how that information is presented. So we really need to flex, or any tool like this, whether you're leveraging Phenotype, insights of this nature, really needs to appreciate both the science that ensures the precision of those insights and the workflow to ensure that it's presented in the most meaningful, efficient manner. Because we'll talk about it in just a little bit, that abrasion, provider abrasion, alert fatigue is certainly present in today's market. With that, I'll jump off from there, is that this industry, as this audience knows more than most, information is key, but it's really diverse and it's scattered across the healthcare ecosystem. Much of this data and the clinical value that it holds is still locked within that unstructured data. When I say unstructured, I mean that data that's in the chart that's locked within a PDF image. We estimate about 80% of the clinical data is still locked as unstructured, that you do need tools like artificial intelligence to draw that out, digitize it, and bring meaning. And it's found across hundreds of platforms. Certainly when you think about electronic health records, you think about the top 5, but there's hundreds of these platforms, clearinghouses, HIEs, and the list goes on, that you really need to factor and address these challenges. And while they're challenging, as leaders, with your commitment, as well as key partnerships, along with taking advantage of some of the advances we're going to be talking about today, interoperability standards, and the maturation of EHR platforms, will allow us to overcome these challenges to develop a patient's longitudinal record that will then be used along with artificial intelligence to bring those insights to calculate and apply a patient's phenotype. Now, as we were just mentioning in response to Lyle's question, is tackling these challenges is meaningful and necessary to mitigate the inefficiencies and abrasion that are plaguing healthcare informatics. As more information becomes available, and we see it every day, they're unlocking some of these platforms we talk about. The conversations I'm having with folks like Epic or Allscripts today are dramatically different than I was having 12, 18, 24 months ago. As more of this information becomes available, we know that provider abrasion and potentially alert fatigue is a real concern. It's one that we have to address, daily, weekly in our discussions. In one discussion with the provider group, as we were looking at solutions, they indicated that success will be judged in part by the number of clicks. The fewest clicks win. Here, they weren't even talking about value. They were just talking about ease and workflow and abrasion. Efficiency and an effective provider engagement is enabled by integrating the various dimensions of information about the patient in order to calculate some of these keen, these unique, these actionable insights, again, leveraging AI, that warrant a provider's attention. We've been talking about phenotype. Brian, maybe you can help the audience and dive in.
Yeah, I think it's good for us to double click for a moment on phenotype. And this is one of many definitions that I think Pixio and you and I have been working with to refine. Phenotypes really, it's that insight into a member's risk profile, member's quality profile, or just in general to that profile to help you drive various actions. Now, it's based on the application of the analytics and artificial intelligence, if you will, some of the natural language processing to interpret that structured or unstructured data. But the key in all of this is identifying characteristics or signals and then creating from that the evidence to support an insight, putting that in front of your providers, putting that in front of your administrators to be able to drive some of those actions. Now, I would say that one of the things we have not touched on are those environmental factors, which we often talk of as social determinants of health. So all of those really come together to help inform and create that longitudinal health record, which is the foundation for being able to build and define those insights. Again, a critical importance in that is the application of those analytics, that analysis of the information, so that the artificial intelligence, that machine learning, can interpret and provide insights that help to drive some of the action. And I see a question from John asking help in explaining the term. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Terry. So in terms of the challenges we've faced as an industry, in terms of trying to bring together disparate, siloed pieces of information, we've looked at your pharmacy claims. You look at your medical claims. Maybe you have an EHR system, but it's isolated from some of your network providers or some of your non-network providers. Each of those has been silos. So the concept behind a phenotype is really, after you've brought those together in that longitudinal record, you've brought those repositories, if you will, together under one umbrella. It's then applying the learnings that your computers have to be able to nurture out an insight, looking at the specific characteristics of that individual member, and not necessarily characteristics, if you will, or patterns of the population, but it's really looking at those of the individual member, and then driving said actions based upon the characteristics of that individual member. So it's really the phenotype, the behaviors, those observations of the member itself.
Yep, and thanks, Brian. And to address some of the questions that are coming in, one additional question on the speaking of AI and workflow was asking, where does this apply in the workflow? And the question was really leading towards perspective. And I just want to highlight that as we in our arena of risk adjustment, we actually are able to control what we call the aperture, the precision of the risk insight, so that we know by controlling that aperture, what's the likelihood of agreement of an audience member with that insight. And we want to control that aperture, whether you're engaging a provider, because research says that you want them to agree at least 70% of the time in order to keep them engaged, for them to see value in that. However, if we point that at coders, we want to open that aperture to give them more of an opportunity to curate and groom that data. And we do point that concept of science, aperture, and workflow at both retrospective, because in risk adjustment, if you're familiar with that arena, you have different windows, sweeps they call them, that you can go back and ensure that you're capturing a complete and accurate indication of risk, or prospective, whether you're at the window, right, grooming that data before the provider sees the patient, during that visit, or even after that visit, before the claim is adjudicated. So we do look at all those windows and how insights, AI, and workflow is most efficiently and effectively designed for those specific windows. In addition, I hope that helped, Lyle. John had a question about, we use the term abrasion.
And Terry, I want to tackle that one just a bit for a second, because
Please.
you've talked a lot about some of the things that we're doing as an industry, honestly, to get to the answer of yes, or to be able to enable that provider to be more effective, more efficient, be able to have a broader set of data elements when they're making a decision or interpretation of a patient's condition. Abrasion is just kind of the reason that we're doing much of this is to avoid that provider from saying, I have had too many clicks, therefore I'm not going to do this action any longer. If they are constantly being barraged with irrelevant alerts, if you will, within the EHR that say you have an individual that needs this quality metric, but in fact they just had that a few weeks ago, that's going to create an abrasion. That's going to create a numbness on the provider, so you're not going to get the desired result, the desired behavioral change that you're wanting to do through the use of technology to help them. And again, I go back to the abrasion that we have with our own texting. If your spell checker continually chooses the wrong word as you're partially filling out the text, pretty soon you're going to turn that off. Well, that's the abrasion we're talking about with providers.
Yeah, alert fatigue is certainly a term you'll hear in association with that. And before we go back to our kind of regular scheduled programming, Chris did ask a question about whether this is, he sees the logic, but is it really literal? And, Chris, I do want to say is that fortunately or unfortunately, Brian and I have been in the industry probably, combined, nearly, 60 years probably. I hate to admit that. But, and we've seen the use of data continue to ebb and flow and expand. I think phenotyping is the next evolution to take in, we've had disease management, focus on the disease, and the coding that was, collecting patients similar, population health that is doing similar, but looking at different cohorts. Phenotype is now taking to a next level where you're using that living, breathing, evolving document about a patient and making it unique to Terry Ward, to Brian Lee, to whoever that might be, because those are unique characteristics and access to some data that we've never had before. Social determinants of health has now become part of our, infrastructure, our vocabulary, as well as details within each of these dimensions that are now leverageable to customize engagement strategies by providers, by payers, to meet that specific and unique characteristic of that patient. They call that a phenotype. Now, you mentioned something about, genomics. I welcome Brian to add here, but I think we're just, when you start to get into genetic, profiling or tags or signals, I think certainly there's, questions of where we take this information and its usability, privacy. But I think we're at the precipice of some of those types of insights that can be added or usable for a profile. Brian, am I missing anything?
No, you're not. I think, Terry, you've really covered it well. I love the new term that Tina has crafted for us, and that's around precision medicine. Really, the concept behind a phenotype, I love it. Well, let's adopt precision medicine as that new term, because it is allowing for the precise delivery of medicine based upon that individual member's characteristics. Back to the genome concept. Genome's really talking about your genetic characterization, if you will, your RNA and DNA of the organism. How those are expressed are really driven by a tremendous amount of environmental factors. And so I think the phenome concept is really that we're looking at the individual and how they have reacted, if you will, within that environment, allowing for that precise delivery of the right action at the right time by the right type of provider.
Brian, anything else on this slide before we continue?
Well, I think the key is that as an industry we've been evolving, as Terry was mentioning, and we all have been observing that a lot of the terms we throw around with population health, with the HIEs, that's just been a maturation of the industry as we move towards it. That's building that repository, building that longitudinal member record. Now the task is to take that information and really leverage it to empower our health system, to empower our providers so they can make more efficient, more timely actions with their members, and then ultimately to measure the outcomes of those behaviors. We talked earlier about the concept of you have best practice medicine, if you will, but that best practice medicine, if you've given a single standard protocol for every time something is presented, it's really looking at it from a population and not necessarily from an individual. We're talking about here tailoring that based upon that individual's phenotype. So really, those insights are powered by artificial intelligence. We can't underestimate the amount of effect that'll have. Terry?
Great. And Julia, I hope that helps answer your question about, does this actually help population health? And I think you heard Brian say it certainly does. As Tina is putting the term precision medicine, it's actually putting a degree of precision to it, which you can still roll up to certain shared characteristics to help those population health initiatives. Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Brian. So far we have defined individually the meaning of phenotype, its challenges, the impact or opportunity, as well as the type of information that can be included. And some of that is being called out here through your questions. What I'd like to do is take a step back and review the entire workflow before we pivot to the rest of our discussion to talk about key components in actually deploying a phenotype. What is it? How is it? And how do we deploy it? First, it is to look across the healthcare ecosystem to capture as much meaningful information as possible. This includes leveraging interoperability solutions, such as we have InfoStream you see listed here, to ingest information from various platforms in as much of an automated fashion as possible. This includes structured information, claims, digitized information, unstructured data. We keep using the example of chart, scanned images, as well as information that's not traditionally included, such as social determinants of health, as well as information about the patient's participation in your care or outreach programs. I know in another role, we did a lot of profiling and engagement, understanding not about key characteristics that are commonly known about a person's ICD codes or CPT, procedure usage, but actually, have they been involved in any outreach programs? How are home health? Have they completed an HRA survey? That type of participatory knowledge, along with social determinants, understand, is there social isolation? Are they having risk around food or other conditions, economic struggles, especially in today's day, that will help inform that specific footprint, fingerprint, phenotype about that individual, so that you can really customize those programs, that engagement. And of course, critical importance is the application of analytics. And what you're hearing from us today is artificial intelligence to really help synthesize all that information to create key characteristics. We'll call them signals, insights, that populates the patient's phenotype profile that then can be leveraged individually or in aggregate to promote action and to drive value-based care initiatives, like you see on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll call them solutions, whether it be initiatives around risk adjustment, quality, call that HEDIS, call that STARS, call that measurement of provider performance to quality standards, clinical guidance. Prior authorization is a hot topic these days as well as life sciences, clinical trial recruitment, outcome research. All of these can be helped supported by proper structure of that data, the science, and the content of that phenotype. Now, we've been using the term phenotype. We've given structure, definition, and some data that helps feed it. I'd like to have you help us understand those that are familiar with phenotype. Let me just make sure we're on the right poll.
I think we need to go to the other one, Terry.
Yeah, are we on the other one? It looks like we may have our polls repeated here because they're both asking about longitudinal records. So I think unless that can be corrected quickly. We might need to just move forward. Oh, sorry. Thank you for that, Brian. So here's the question is just, has your company begun or have plans to begin utilizing Phenotype program at your organization? 3 responses, either not currently utilizing, initially begun utilizing, or well integrated in the use of Phenotype. So we'll just pause here for a second or two and let you respond. Just to give you, as you're responding, a little forecast. In the next section of our discussion, we're going to cover just and kind of start to transition from the what, the defining of it, the contents of it, and really start to talk about why it's important and how best to really engage, some key characteristics on the implementation, deployment of a phenotype.
We go to the next slide, Terry.
Thank you. And there we go.
Perfect. So we like Terry was mentioning, we really need to dive into why you would want to leverage patient phenotypes. And there's a lot of very good questions about, does phenotype roll up to some sort of a summary? How do you go about using it to avoid kind of that click fatigue, if you will, or the alert fatigue? And let's start first with access. Patient phenotype gives the user access to a much richer set of information, insights, if you will, into that what makes that individual's condition unique. It really doesn't roll it up. It doesn't look at it at a much broader sense. It looks at it at an individual basis. The predictions, if you will call them a prediction, really the insight is at a member specific. So it gives that a much richer understanding of that information. Evidence, it's really tied to the evidence of that individual's phenotype, their profile, their history. Many of us know it's human nature for us to understand the why when we're being asked to do the what. And I think kind of to answer the questions, we've had a couple around the whole notion around alert fatigue or provider fatigue. We naturally are curious to understand why something is in there. And by pointing those individuals to the evidence, by supporting it with a high degree of confidence, that we can point them more rapidly to come to the same conclusion that we have around a given opportunity to intervene on an individual's care path, a gap, that's going to help to avoid some of those fatigue. The more often that you're asking a provider to do or respond to something and they go through the negative is going to build that fatigue up, if you will, and ultimately make that tool ineffective. So by basing it on the evidence, which is what a patient phenotype is going to do, it's going to drive the why behind it. It's going to show that provider, who most providers are going to look for the evidence. They're not just going to take the word of an alert. Last portion, which is probably one of the most important, is really ensuring that there's quality, that you're improving that overall experience for the member and their quality delivery. That's why we call it, really the quality care, understanding what metrics are needed to be able to drive those meaningful information to the provider so they can act quickly. So access, evidence, and quality all kind of come together to help deliver a patient phenotype to the point of care where the provider is able to act effectively at that member's behest. Again, tailored individually to that patient. Terry, we move to the next.
Great. There were a couple questions that I'll kind of link together around promoting healthcare systems with data. One of the things as we get into phenotype and unique characteristics has come up in the chat around systems pushing of data. And I think, there's a Lyle, I think, is bringing this up as well around is that information flow is real bidirectional. It's not just about extracting information to power the capturing the calculation of a phenotype trait, an insight, but it is about pushing those insights to the right person at the right time to impact change. A common example, an easy example is, one that Brian is actually leading, is actually pushing some of these risk insights that either have been curated by a coder or not directly into the EHR workflow so that it can be part of that consideration. Obviously, you want to have those be high precision, high confidence, so that the provider can say, as he's seeing Terry Ward, I need to look at and consider these historic findings, these insights with evidence as I am engaging Terry for treatment. So there is a bidirectional component that is really part of that success. Perfect.
Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of the challenges to implementing a phenotype within your organization. And it always starts with data. The old adage of garbage in, garbage out, well, that's going to create the provider fatigue. So we want to ensure the data needs are being met overall by the organization. The first piece, and Terry and I both mentioned this in our previous conversations around interoperability. With today's standards for interfacing with the EHR systems, you should be able to very effectively, with a great degree of confidence, be able to retrieve that member medical record. That becomes the first foundation for your repository, if you will. Also bringing in much of that member demographics. And it isn't just about the age, sex, and gender. It's understanding the behaviors around their enrollment, their disenrollment behaviors. Some of the social determinant data comes in, is very rich from that member demographic information. Then you start to layer in some of the other analysis that happens around that member, looking at some of their billing and some of the aspects of their engagement, if you will, with both the health plan and the provider group in terms of their financial integration. Understanding those social determinants, getting a mechanism in to understand if they have limitations on their transportation, if they live in geographic markets where there is a challenge for food, for access to food, if there isn't a grocery center within so many miles of that individual's residence. All of those data needs, if you will, come together, and that's what helps create that foundation for implementing that phenotype. Many of you have built that today. They're just different garages. Well, we used to go from a garage to a warehouse to a lake or a repository. All of those are building that necessary foundation for building and creating that phenotype. The next ingredient, obviously, then is being able to have ready access to that data on a timely fashion, making sure that using that interoperability, that you have regular pulls of that medical data, that you have a quick interface into that member information so that can be processed by your artificial intelligence engine to be able to bring those insights at a timely fashion. Terry, you want to talk a little bit about some of the enterprise needs?
Yeah, as we go through these four pillars of implementation considerations, I just want to characterize as Brian and I share these topics. What Brian is really, speaking to, you have data needs, as he just reminded us, and he'll dive into architectural requirements. So those are kind of foundational infrastructure requirements that are needed. But equally important is the tactical expression and planning of that. Not only planning architecturally or from a data sourcing, but from an enterprise perspective, because deployment or successful deployment of any key strategic solution that is rooted in leveraging meaningful, actionable information, as Brian just mentioned, it is critical to define and anticipate what success looks like at the end of the day. For each of the initiatives, planning and defining that success for each of the initiatives where phenotype and the insight it contains can be targeted across your enterprise. Like other solutions, defining what success looks like helps your organization capture the requirements, incorporate the necessary information, as Brian mentioned, and features that you need to include, as well as integrating the specific science and artificial intelligence models that are needed to generate the insights presented in the patient's phenotype that will be most beneficial to your enterprise, including those patient characteristics that drive initiatives such as, we mentioned quality, STARS, HEDIS, risk adjustment, care coordination, care management, forecasting. Each of these require your enterprise to really anticipate what definition of success looks like at the end of the day, so that you can build and create all those building blocks around requirements, features, data, deployment, and we'll talk in just a little bit about the teams and the deployment and the socialization that's needed. With that, Brian?
So let's take it from enterprise really back down to the architectural requirements, and I'm not going to get into the data structures that are necessary, but I'm going to talk about some of the principles that you need to think about as you're building that foundation for the phenotype. The first and probably the most important is getting near real-time data acquisition. And I can't emphasize that enough, that it's about getting the right information to the right individuals at the right time, the time in which they're having an intervention with that patient, that member, if you will. So that near real-time acquisition, and that's going to take, for many of us, a different architectural approach to how you are acquiring and storing that data. The notion behind a garage or one of those storage bins that you go and rent and throw your bike in and only pull it out for spring, that's not going to fly when we're talking about the necessity for real-time phenotyping. Now, there is a need for historical data. So don't get it wrong, you're going to have an architecture that has the ability to really maintain a very large historical repository of information, but be able to access new data as it's coming in and build on that member's profile. I think the second most important principle is self-service. And this is one that often will get a lot of questions around, what do you mean by self-service? Well, there's a lot of different use cases, and you need to look at your organization's overall corporate use case, if you will, for this phenotyping, if you will, the patient or member phenotyping. But really, it needs to be thought of in terms of having the ability to serve that information for the specific needs of that individual. So it's having access to that information individually, and not thinking about so much about pushing it out and constantly having to be the organization that pushes, but rather allow for the individual to pull. Again, I emphasize enough, we could be all things to all people, narrow those focuses down to those key objectives. The other, I think, is evolving to become a very important portion in your architectural requirements is being multilingual, being able to accommodate more than just your standard English language. Natural language processors are available to be able to interpret multiple languages, not just the English language, and making sure you build an architecture that recognizes multiple languages within its construct. And probably also foundation kind of almost needs to go without, can go without being said, is design it for both structured and unstructured data. We've talked a lot about that. We all are very familiar with structured data. That's how much of our industry began. CPT codes, ICD codes, problem lists. Now let's start incorporating that unstructured data, those physician notes, those referral notes, those pre-authorization notes where we're explaining it. And let's leverage that in a way and store it in a way that we can tag that information for that member's profile, allow the machine to be able to interpret and read that. And lastly, I would say it's allow for and think about the ability to take that feedback loop into the system. Terry and I talked a bit about making sure that we understand what action that provider is taking at the point of care. That's going to help to inform and improve this system. If that member phenotype indicates that an individual has a given reaction to a given drug, et cetera, we want to make sure that we're not pushing a certain drug in front of that provider on a regular basis. Incorporate that into the machine learning process to create that feedback loop so that the machines continue to learn and alleviate that potential, the errors or omissions or abrasions that might occur at the point of care. Terry, with that, why don't we talk a little bit about team engagement?
That sounds great. Thanks, Brian. You know, success in deploying a patient's phenotype, as I mentioned before, and Brian's just bringing up some great points about that planning, the architectural requirements. We're hearing these concepts that build up to a phenotype being a high priority for many of our clients, whether it be coming under the term of chart repository or the term we're using today, longitudinal record, that then can be leveraged to, you know, with science to build it. But, you know, success in deploying is as much about these foundational elements that Brian's mentioning as it is about leadership endorsement, transparency, and working with senior leaders, many of which are on today's call, and they're tactical leaders. So, who is a CFO working with the vice president of risk management, CMO, or even the CEO, where stars may be reporting to, manage quality management, provider network design, care coordination. These tactical leaders need to be engaged to socialize the value and educate the organization on the use of the phenotype within each of these key strategic and enterprise initiatives, as I'm mentioning here: risk, quality, care coordination, fraud, waste, and abuse, continuity of care programs. And so as we look back here on what really requires the implementation of a phenotype, what you're hearing as themes from Brian and I are the need to plan and anticipate, whether it be your data needs, looking across the diversity of your systems and getting away from some of these even traditional systems and looking into, as we mentioned, the social determinants, the participation in care programs, the architectural requirements. But on the flip side, on the right side, it also requires planning to anticipate your needs strategically as an enterprise, to know your destination in order to plan these parts, as well as from a team to, like any strategic solution, to get the endorsement and to really go from endorsement, strategic leadership, to transparency, socialization, and ultimately repetitive education on the value that this asset, this phenotype, holds for your organization to meet those definitions of success that you defined at the beginning. And before we pivot to summary, I noticed that a few questions have come in here. Brian, I'm just looking at them now. I'm not sure if you had a chance to peek. But I know that one of the questions was asking about access to pharmacies, pharmacy data, big box pharmacies. And clearly that's key. I know that in my prior role, sometimes pharmacy, when I was looking at mostly at structured data at the time, pharmacy would add another 30% of valuable clinical insight, and there's a lot of analytic value there. And I agree that tapping into those, either directly through some of these connections, CVS, Walgreens, clearinghouses have been another great source. We oftentimes connect with our payers who are also aggregating that information. They're going to their PBMs to access that information as well. So agree with the need to consider that for whether it be medication adherence or other pharmacy triggered insights. Access is key, and those access points are oftentimes diverse in nature. So.
Yeah, and Terry, I think one of the pieces that is kind of highlighted here in terms of often we ask about the claims data, the durable medical equipment, your pharmacy claims data, but really often when we overlook things like laboratory results, we overlook those indicators when a prescription is not picked up at the pharmacy. Those are very key elements to artificial intelligence. It's part of those factors that are helping to define that member's phenotype. If they don't have the money to pay that copay to be able to pick up that prescription, that's what's preventing them from ultimately getting the coverage they need. Those are the types of things where your artificial intelligence are going to help. So retrieving and collecting and accumulating that information is really important. And again, it goes back to, it may be a very small fraction of your membership, but it's very meaningful information for that individual's phenotype being developed.
Yep. And before we pivot to kind of the last section here, last topic of summary, and continue to open up for questions. There was a question about the type of information, the type of insights. Chris, mentioned a few, FHIR, relational, graphical in nature. In the area of data ingestion, extraction, I've spoken on this topic a number of times, is unfortunately, healthcare is so diverse, the healthcare data ecosystem is so diverse, is that you really have to be versed or engage those that are, hire that Sherpa, that person who's going to really carry this topic on their back to success, because There is no one single source vehicle format of data. We at Apixio are looking at FHIR API from Epic, Unity API from Allscripts, CCDAs from various EHRs or HIEs, and I'm throwing a lot of acronyms here, but you really need to be versed in, we're getting, again, everything from PDF files to FHIR APIs to CCDAs with XML wrappers and everything in between. So this is a diverse ecosystem until we start to get normalization as an industry, which certainly is a number of steps away. I think your organization, either with partners, really will need to carry some of that burden forward to take on, to make sure that you're answering some of those initial questions that we're highlighting here around phenotype. What data, the ingestion, that longitudinal record, and then, of course, the science on top of it. With that, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, and I just want to thank, on our behalf, Brian and I, we love engaging folks like you. The questions have been great. Hopefully, we've answered the majority of those, and at time permitting, we'll still address a few. But this industry is in a complex pivot. There is healthcare informatics suffers from a wealth of information with challenges in access, the analysis, the distillation of information into those actionable insights. That has been a struggle as long as I've been in the industry, and we are making progress. Artificial intelligence is a key advancement. Some of these interoperability standards are helping certainly along the way. But it is through leveraging partnerships or your own expertise, the deployment of mature interoperability capabilities, and the application of focused artificial intelligence based on what we just mentioned, the designing and understanding what your destination, your definition of success looks like, that can help transform the living, breathing, longitudinal record to reveal the value that a patient's phenotype can hold to drive action, efficiency, and return on investment for your organization's value-based care programs, initiatives. I really, again, want to thank you for your time. We do have 3 minutes officially left. We'll leave a minute or so for Morgan to come back on, but I do see a question from John or Brian, if you have any that you've seen. It looks like who, what, where, when is social determinant data being collected? That's a great question. Brian and I actually share some experience that separately, we actually have owned social determinants solutions, initiatives, programs. And so this is obviously one of those topics that's in meaningful evolution. But whether it be ICD-10 Z codes is certainly a starting point. But a lot of organizations, I've either come from or have worked with, are actually putting reconnaissance in the field in addition to those Z codes. So they really look at where are we leveraging contact with providers and patients today, whether it be care coordination, care managers, outreach, telephone calls. That anytime there's a call contact made, they're also leveraging that data in a standard fashion to collect these insights, to collect in a normalized, standardized fashion. So, John, just to kind of help summarize here is that there is data out there. There are libraries of programs out there. I would say that this data is both a mixture of standard information, but also a lot of reconnaissance to collect that information that's unique, that needs to be standardized and pulled back into your arena for analysis. Brian, am I missing anything on that topic?
No, we're just about wrapped, but one thing I would say, John, and that is focus. Stay focused on the things that will have meaningful delivery. Don't try to boil the ocean. Focus on some of those SDOH measures that you know you can take action on, or you know your provider network can take action on. Great. But like Terry, I'd like to express, great appreciation. Thank you all for your time. Happy to entertain questions later as well. Morgan, I don't know if you wanted to jump on and.
Absolutely. That is all the time we have for today, unfortunately. But I want to give a final thank you to Terry and Brian for a really excellent presentation, and also Apixio for sponsoring today's webinar. If you'd like to learn more about the content presented today, please do check out the resources section on your webinar console. And in that, also please fill out the post-webinar survey. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we really hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.